So it's a real pleasure for me to be able to introduce Professor Eric Sanderson to you. I've gotten to know Eric through several things. One is the Science and Resiliency Institute for Jamaica Bay, and also through doing some lobbying last year concerning the Ocean Action Plan down in Washington, D.C. Eric works for the Wildlife Conservation Service, and that service not only does wildlife conservation, but they actually manage several of the major environmental activities of New York City, the Bronx Zoo, Central Park Zoo, and the New York Aquarium. We actually have some of our graduates working for the New York Aquarium, and I think they're all MCP students. So our relationship has built over the last several years, and I also was involved in helping him to put together this latest, I think this is your latest book, on prospects for resilience for Jamaica Bay. It's a bestseller, right?
I hope so.
Okay. So,
maybe after today.
But Eric probably is more famous for the book he wrote, Manhattan, and that came out, I believe, in 2009, and it really is a vision of what Manhattan looked like pre-colonial days, and absolutely fascinating story. Eric has a PhD degree from University of California, Davis, and it's in ecosystem and landscape ecology. He's written a number of books. I've only mentioned two, but I might also mention he wrote another book called Terra Nova, The New World After Oil, Cars, and Suburbs. And he's also written a number of professional papers. He's traveled to 40 countries with his work with the Conservation Society. So it's a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for coming out to Big Bag City, to the countryside, and look forward to your talk.
Thanks, Larry. Thanks, that was a great introduction. Let me start this. Oops. There we go. Yep, thank you. Thanks, everybody, and thanks very much for coming out. I always have a great time when I come out to Stony Brook University, which I have several times. Once for the English department, actually, several years ago, to talk about the historical ecology work. So I'm here today to talk about Jamaica Bay and talk about some of the things we found out through this book. If you follow people on Twitter, you can follow me or you can follow my organization. Those are the Twitter handles there. There we go. Okay, so like Larry said, although I work for a global conservation organization, I happen to fall into this project about what New York City was like 400 years ago when Henry Hudson arrived. And the reason I think that's important is because when we look at the big bad city, as Larry says, it's hard to imagine it as an environmental place when you see it like this. It's a little easier to do if we imagine what Henry Hudson might have seen 400 years ago when it looked something more like this. So this was Manhattan, which is where we get Manhattan from. And it was a long, thin, wooded island. And through very detailed historical ecology reconstructions, we figured out that there were 54 ecosystems on Manhattan, 1,000 different species. There were people who had been living there for 8,000 years before Henry Hudson arrived, the Lenape people. And it was really a remarkable place that was representative of what the whole world was like back then, in the sense that there were big wild places all over the world, and people were relatively few and relatively small. And it's not to say one is better or worse than the other, but it's been a big transition, and that big transition has led to conservation movements. It's led to scientific discoveries and development of science, and it's led us to rethink what cities mean. Manhattan, kind of much to my surprise, was a huge success in New York City. People love to think about the natural environment of the city, and I think people in New York are really longing for a way to connect not just with the jobs and the culture and the economy of cities, but actually to the nature of the place. So much so that at the end of the Mannahatta time, I would give talks like this, and people would say, "What? You're not going to do the Bronx or Brooklyn or Queens? What about Staten Island?" So that's what we've been working on since, and we call the Wilikia Project. The Wilikia Project, that word is a Lenape word, and it means my good home. And this is how we want people to think of New York City, as a place that's really good for people, as a place that will last for a long time, particularly if we kind of change a little bit the way we think about our lives in the city with respect to the environment. And in that way, Jamaica Bay, which is on the south shore of the city down here, becomes a very useful opportunity for thinking about how our thinking needs to change relative to the environment. So I just want to say just a few words at the top, particularly for the students in the room, about why I think that historical ecology is essential to the practice of urban sustainability. First, it helps us extend the time frame of our thinking. It's really hard to imagine sustainability on a day-by-day or a monthly basis, or the kind of mayoral terms that the city is sort of organized around, 4-year terms. You really need to be thinking over decades and arguably centuries to really build true sustainability in the city. Second, historical ecology helps us figure out how nature makes places. In the urban environment, we're used to think about how people make places through buildings and architecture and urban planning and so forth. But nature makes places too, and that's particularly obvious when we start to talk about the historical ecology. Three, as I'll argue, it helps us imagine the ecological potential of the place. Nobody comes to New York City and says, "Oh, the economy can only be so big," or "We can only have so much music," or "so many paintings," or "so many kind of communications." But people tend to be very down on what the ecological potentials of the city are. And I want to break that open. I want to open up that conversation about how environmental, how ecological we make our city, despite the buildings and the roads and the infrastructure. And in that sense, I think historical ecology provides metrics of success. Those pictures I showed you, those maps of Wilikia and Mannahatta, those landscapes have been in that form for thousands of years before Henry Hudson arrived. They're actually a true metric of sustainability, long-term sustainability. If we could get our city to work like a forest again, if we could get our shoreline to work like a beach again, then it too would last for thousands of years. And if you really love living in the city, as I do, if you really, and as most New Yorkers do, they really love their place. If they really love their place, then we ought to want it to love it for the future. And we ought to be opening up ways in the future. And historical ecology gives us a new way to think about those potentials. And I'll just give you an example of that. These are a couple maps I made right after Hurricane Sandy, kind of early on in the Wilikia process. This was the map of the historical wetlands of New York City at the time that we had. This is a map of the flood zones in New York City at the time of Hurricane Sandy. And this is a map of the overlap between them. And you don't have to be a rocket scientist or a historical ecologist to see that there's a relationship between these two maps. That most of the places that flooded during Hurricane Sandy were places that were formerly salt marshes 400 years ago. So let's go to Jamaica Bay. And this is a reconstructed view based on some of the work we've been doing about what Jamaica Bay might have looked like on the day that Henry Hudson arrived 400 years ago. So a very shallow bay with these big marginal wetlands. And you can see Mannahatta here in the distance up there. So I want to tell you a little bit how we've come to this idea of what Jamaica Bay might have been like, and then what it means going forward in the future. Of course, Jamaica Bay doesn't look like that anymore. It looks more like this. Probably many of us have, if we haven't been on the ground there, we've seen it by looking out of the window of an airplane as we take off from JFK Airport. It's heavily urbanized on the margins of Jamaica Bay. The former fringing salt marshes have been filled in and constructed on, whether they're natural land, sometimes they're landfills like here. In other cases, they're communities that have been built on top of the salt marshes. You can see the Rockaway Peninsula in the distance has also been constructed on, that it's year-round housing and businesses for people. There's roads and railways and infrastructure. And these are really wonderful communities, and they're characteristic of New York City, the city of neighborhoods, that they have distinctive styles and characteristics, whether we're talking about Broad Channel or Far Rockaway or Canarsie. But they also have characteristic ecological systems associated with them. Beaches and salt marshes and maritime forests. And you know, as I know many of you know and study here at SoMAS, that these coastal communities are really driven by their disturbance regimes. Buried in sand, so that's beach grass, you know, forming a dune on the side of the beach, or you know, drowned in salt water like the salt marshes are on every high tide. And of course, the species that live there are adapted to these conditions. So sanderlings, for example, forage along the wash zone along the beach, and they move in and out. And when a big storm comes, what do sanderlings do? They don't stay on the beach, they fly away, right? And other species like this diamondback terrapin have these very special adaptations to live in this coastal environment, this kind of harsh and dynamic environment. Diamondback terrapins are the only salt marsh turtle, and they actually they float up and down. They find nesting grounds. They actually cry out the salt to maintain their homeostasis. They're really extraordinary species. So if you're going to live in the coastal zone, what nature tells us is either you need to be able to get out fast like the sanderlings do, or you need to be able to adapt to the changing conditions there and have special sort of rigor and armoring and adaptations for that environment, like the terrapin. And of course, this is all in the context that the atmospheric systems are quite dynamic. This is Hurricane Sandy, as you'll recognize. My colleagues tell me a maybe 1 in 400-year storm that hit Jamaica Bay and New York City, the second most damaging storm in U.S. history so far, and caused really extensive damages, particularly on the Rockaways, where not only was there flood damage, but there was a fire afterwards that took a number of people's lives. And these images, you know, I'm showing them to you because they're a tragedy. They're a tragedy. They're a tragedy for the people that are destroyed. They're a hole in the city. They're a problem to be solved going into the future. But these kinds of things are an avoidable tragedy in my view. This is not the kind of thing that has to happen. And it's certainly not in our world, you know, God's wrath or some, you know, unforeseen, you know, event that nature wreaks on the place. These are kinds of things that we can foresee going forward. Not maybe the exact timing or the severity of them, but that there will be storms in the future just as there have been storms in the past. And it's this kind of understanding that we're trying to get at through with the book that actually Larry stepped in and helped lead the chapter on the physical systems of Jamaica Bay, which was hugely helpful, and I really appreciate his work on that. You know, this book is not resilience figured out. It's prospects for resilience going forward, recognizing the complexities of the environment. It's really trying to just lay the basis of what we know about Jamaica Bay and say, well, how can we start to think about how to make the system more resilient? And I hope 20 years from now, someone writes the book, Jamaica Bay Resilient, and says, oh, well, they got this right and they didn't get that right and they should have thought about this more. One of the points where these things come down, you know, in sort of historical terms, there's things that happen over long periods of times, and then there are particular events, particular decision points. And one of them is about the U.S. Army Corps' tentatively selected plan to build a set of tidal floodgates across the Rockaway Inlet. This isn't actually built. This is a picture of a similar kind of project in the Netherlands. And these things they're floodgates, so they're designed to be open most of the time and let the waters flush in and out. There's 4 sewage treatment plants that release their effluent into Jamaica Bay. And even though the city's done a wonderful job trying to reduce the amount of nitrogen in the sewage, there's still an enormous amount of nitrogen that comes into the bay and needs to be washed out. And so it's really important that the tidal regime maintained in the bay. But what the design of these things is to raise the gates on the extreme storm surge and protect the areas inland to them. This is a map of the plan. So coastal hardening and beach stabilization along the Rockaways, the tidal gate here between the barrier island and Floyd Bennett Field, and then a series of other protections going around here and over to Coney Island, basically hardening the extreme western edge of the South Shore barrier island system of Long Island. And I like to show this. This is the budget. This is the budget that's in the Army Corps' plan. These are various alternatives. This is the one they picked, $3.8 billion. And for those of you who write grants here at Stony Brook, I'll just note that the IDC, the indirect costs on a $3.8 billion project are $333 million. My administrators would be very pleased to receive a check for $333 million. So you know, what I want to question and what I want to bring into comparison with each other is Jamaica Bay 400 years ago and Jamaica Bay today, and talk to you about how and get your ideas about how this helps us think about, say, Jamaica Bay 400 years from now. What kind of Jamaica Bay do we want to see 400 years from now that will be resilient, given sea level rise, given economic changes, and given changes in human society going forward? And I'll propose to you that it's how we think about these systems that leads that evolution into the future. So let me just talk to you a little bit about how we do the historical ecology, because I think it's cool, and I think it's interesting, and it helps us think about these dynamics. So we use historical maps, like this one. This is the famous Hassler chart of 1844, a chart of New York Harbor. This map was produced by the U.S. Coast Survey, which was the first scientific agency of the U.S. government, founded in 1807 when Thomas Jefferson was president. And the point of the U.S. Coast Survey was to map the coast for navigation purposes. And they hired this guy, Ferdinand Rudolf Hassler, a Swiss cartographer, to be the leading, to lead the Coast Survey. And he was famous for being very particular and very detailed and a very hardworking boss, and pushing his employees to do a lot of work. You can see here that there's all these bathymetric observations at depths and soundings in the harbor, but you can see they also did quite a bit of work in the coastal zone on land for navigation purposes, so that you could actually see what's going on land and figure out where you were. Here's Jamaica Bay over here on the side. This sort of stippling are showing salt marshes here. This is the Barren Island system, which actually has an Atlantic cedar swamp on it. You can see the beaches of Coney Island and Pelican Beach, and here's the Rockaways, and you can actually see the dunes, the line of dunes built up on the beach. Very, very detailed map. We take these maps and we georeference them to the modern city in a geographic information system, so that we can lay other data on top of it in the same space. These are the building footprints for that same part of the world. So the underlying map, again, is 1844. These are the building footprints from 2014. Each one of these little red polygons, and you can see like Breezy Point out here would be in the water of 1844, right? We trace features off of these maps, and then we compile them across many, many different historical maps. So in this case, it's the salt marshes and the internal wetlands, freshwater wetlands. We can also digitize the underwater bathymetric contours off the shore of Jamaica Bay, and for those of you that study coastal dynamics, you'll recognize what's going on there with the sort of deltaic feature off the Rockaway Inlet. We also get the shoreline, and I just highlight this because we use maps from different years. We use some 18th century maps, we use early 19th, and then all through the 19th century maps. And of course, what the shoreline is changes depending on which map you're looking at, right? It changes because the definition of what the shoreline is changes depending on what the cartographer's interests are. So you have to sort of see it with this kind of humanity lens of who made the map, why did they make it, what was their purpose, what kind of technology do they have, what was their intentions with the map, right? All maps are selections out of reality. No map is all of reality. It's always some selection of reality. So you have to sort of see it in that lens. But then we also have to bring our oceanographic hat to it too, which is that the sea level was rising over this period, right? So if the sea level is rising, then this line has to be tied to what the sea level might have been in 1844. So we use sea level graphs like this one from Big Hugh. I like to show this one because this is the long-term sea level rise. This is the last 20,000 years of sea level rise. So here's the sea level in meters here, and this is the age in thousands of years going back. So this is at the height of the last glaciation in this part of the world, 20,000 years ago. And you can see that the sea levels come up 120 meters. This is very compelling in the city because if you take the shoreline 120 meters down, then the shore is 100 miles away from New York City. Now, if the shore is 100 miles away from New York City, that means Manhattan isn't an island, it's just the hill, right? besides this river, which is the Hudson River cutting through a fjord beside it. And Jamaica Bay is just a little valley, like maybe a little grassy valley or a forested valley. That's 120 miles. You'd have to walk 120 miles to get to the shore. And then we can, use the bathymetric charts to bring the water up. So 15,000 years ago, this was approximately the shoreline. And 10,000 years ago, this was approximately the shoreline. And 5,000 years ago, this was the shoreline. It starts to look something more like what we know today. And here is our shoreline today in the same data. And the reason this is important is because sea level rise isn't just isn't the recent times, right? It's actually a historical geological phenomenon. I don't need to tell you all that. You all know that already. But it helps put into context sort of our more recent sea level rise. This is from Andy Kemp and Ben Horton, and this is based on reconstructions from foraminiferum and salt marshes in New Jersey, just over the last 200 years or so. But you can see the sea level rise, and you can see it's a little faster in the 20th century. But this is something that coastal environments have had to deal with for at least the last 20,000 years ago, and of course millions of years before that. And it means that the beaches and the salt marshes that were formerly 120 miles offshore migrated over the last 20,000 years until eventually they got to where they are today, right? So this movement of sand and sediment and plant material is part of the way these ecosystems work. That's part of the way they've been adapted to work, and it continues to today as the sea level continues to change. It's not something brand new. It's actually the way these systems are meant to work. So to do that for the Wailikia project, it means we can take all these historical maps, we get off the shoreline and the topographic data and the bathymetric information, we integrate it together, and eventually produce a digital elevation model like this, DEM, in the GIS. And I apologize a little bit for the garish colors. My cartography guy was a little crazy this day. But anyway, so the pink colors here are basically under the water. The blue areas are in the intertidal zone, and then the greens and the oranges are up in the upland zone. And this topographic information is very important for ecological reconstruction in many, many different ways. It also means for our project that we have to drop, most people are about predicting where the shoreline will be in the future, right? Sea level rise, but we actually do sea level drop to get back to 1609, right? To actually figure out where the 1609 shoreline would have been. I just want to point out Far Rockaway, which is here, was always quite high and is quite high still today. It's a little bit higher. And it's actually a Pleistocene relic that one of the earlier glaciation events left this sort of larger gravel bar that kind of wraps around Jamaica Bay and becomes sort of root of the Barrier Island system. I'm going to show you a reconstructed picture where this little triangle is of the really massive and extensive salt marshes that were once on the edge of Jamaica Bay. So this is Canarsie 400 years ago. Canarsie, by the way, being a reference to the Canarsie tribe or tribelet of the Lenape people. It's a Lenape name. That's where we get Canarsie from. And they lived here on this sort of neck of forested land in these very extensive salt marsh systems. And if you look at the patterns of Lenape occupation of New York City, it's all right along the coast. They love to live in environments like this. Very, very productive environments. Lots of food, oysters and clams in the water, huge diatomous fish runs coming up these streams, particularly the Hudson River side, but also all these little streams coming up through the salt marshes, turtles and so forth in the salt marshes. Very, very, very good life. They had lots and lots of food to eat. They also grew gardens of corn, beans, and squash. And they lived in that way. The Lenape had been in this part of the world for at least 1,000 years before Hudson shows up. So we take these digital elevation models. They help us understand something about the dynamics. And of course, this is on the ocean-facing side. There's the east to west movement of sediment that has to do with the orientation of Long Island to the prevailing wind and energy currents. And I'm feeling a little nervous because I know so many people in the audience know more about this than I do. But basically, these waves are bringing sand up on the beach. And actually, if you stand on the beach of the Rockaways, you can see the waves come in with an angle and then they go out at a slightly different angle. And when they do that, they leave a little bit of sand on the shore on the regular tidal cycle. And eventually those sands build up the coastal system. So, this is nature's way of protecting us from big storms, is that on the regular tidal cycle, there's accretion of the sands along the beach. And then the winds blow that into dunes, which are then stabilized by the dune grass. And then when that big storm comes, the wave energy hits those dunes. Some of it's absorbed by the dunes, often knocks the dunes down. Then the water that goes over the top goes into these extensive marsh systems back behind that are absorptive. And so instead of the water slamming into the beaches or into the forest, that's where the energy and the water goes. And then it drains back out to the sea as the tide goes down after the storm surge. And you can really see this, that this actually tends to build the land along the south shore, I should say. It tends to build the land from the east toward the west, and you can actually see these series of inlets even today in this modern satellite image like this. And there's a whole progression of them, right? From out here, way out east, coming all the way to where we are here. Coney Island is the last one. Coney Island, Brooklyn is the last one. And then if this satellite image extended down here in New Jersey, you would see the same thing coming up the Jersey Shore, right? And what's breaking it but the force of the Hudson River coming down this way, right? And you can actually see that in the charts. You can actually see how the sand's coming this way. And then here you get the Verrazano Narrows, and there's a steeper thing, and the sand is going off that way and off around this way. So these coastal survey charts, they were such an important part of navigation, right? It was very difficult to get into New York Harbor because there were all these sandy shoals and they were moving around. So the Coastal Survey made several different charts over the course of the 19th century. And I'm going to show you several of these focusing on the Rockaway Inlet and the mouth of Jamaica Bay. So just keep your eye on this part of the chart here. So here's Hassler in 1844. This is Bakke in 1861. Alexander Dallas Bakke was the next superintendent of the Coastal Survey. This is Bakke in 1882. And this is Titman. He was the third superintendent in 1907. Eventually, the Coastal Survey got folded into NOAA, to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, right around this time. So you can see, do you see that? So these are all georeferenced to each other into the modern geography. So 1844, 1861, 1882, 1907. You can also see the cities building out from up here. So now look up here. So there's Manhattan, here's Brooklyn, there's Williamsburg. This is all countryside, right? These are all farms. Whoops, sorry. You can see it building out 1861, 1882, 1907. If we just look at the Rockaways by themselves, and I just show you the shoreline, it looks like this. And you notice the scale is 1,000 meters. That's 1 kilometer, on the bar down there. And we can actually put a dot, on the westernmost extent of the peninsula at each point in time. And then we can measure the GPS coordinates here. And then we can use the distance formula to calculate how far it's moved. And we can calculate on average between 1844 and 1907 that the Rockaway Peninsula is moving 77 meters per year to the west and 32 meters to the south, which means that over that period it grew 3 miles. 3 miles of land that nature made. And there was actually a court case about who owns that land. Who owns the land that nature makes? Right? Who owns that? So it's actually a very interesting question, right? Because our legal system, presupposes that you draw a line on the map, which is on your, on your legal contract that says that's what you own, and then it's supposed to stay there, right? The legal system doesn't, imagine that some of it goes away or some of it gets added onto. And in fact, in the War of 1812, the U.S. government appropriated some land at the end of the Rockaway Peninsula to build a blockhouse because they were afraid the British were going to attack New York from the Brooklyn side, like they had during the Revolution, right? And so they took it from the Cornell family, one branch of which later went on to found the university upstate. And then fast forward 40 years later, who owns that land? Is it the U.S. federal government owns that land because they appropriated it? Or is it the Cornell family, right? And nobody really knew, so there was a big court case, and in the end they kind of settled out of court about who owned that. If we were to extrapolate this forward, then it would say that the tip of the Rockaway should be here in 2014. And obviously that didn't happen, right? It's also true if you go back in time that it would say that there would be no Rockaway Peninsula at all if the same patterns have been in place. So there was, something about the dynamics of the 19th century are different than the dynamics of the 18th and 17th century, and they're different than what happened later. And I'm going to talk about both of those scenarios. First, though, we're going to go back in time. So there's earlier maps, of course, of this region. These aren't done with quite the level of skill and geometric precision as the Coastal Survey charts. We can georeference these as well, but we can interpret them in a qualitative sense. They're not valueless just because we can't georeference them and put them in the GIS. This is comparing two maps by John Eddy. John Eddy was a cartographer, and in 1811 he published the first map of 30 miles around New York City. Another really famous map, very valuable. And then it was so well loved that they redid it in the 1830s, and this is the Eddy map of 1839, John Dursnell and John Eddy. And I've just clipped out the Rockaway Peninsula here, and you can see in 1811 you have Barren Island and Pelican Bar here, and you can see you have it Barren Island, but Pelican Bar is a subsurface bar in 1839. Also on the Rockaways here. So you can see here's the Rockaway Peninsula, and here's the Rockaway Peninsula, and here it says New Inlet, opened January 1839 by a big storm, and then they filled it in here, and there's shipwrecks here. So you can actually see, even in these qualitative maps, the evidence of coastal evolution continuing. So we're going to go back further in time. Oops, sorry. So this is Simeon DeWitt's famous map of New York State from 1802. Here's the Rockaway Neck. Here's Barren Island. You can see with a different configuration. Here has two inlets, and this one's sticking out here. See, Coney Island also has a different shape here, and then just this little off island. For a long time, this was Coney Island. It's just this little thing right here. You also see there's many fewer islands in the middle of Jamaica Bay. Here it only has two, and a couple ones over here by Head of Fly. This is a British map. This is from 1781. It's a British Army map. So it emphasizes the land portion, but you see these really extensive salt marshes, and this very thin Rockaway Inlet and this Barren Island with, again, two inlets. This is a British nautical chart. This is from the seaward view. DeBar's, 1777. You can see here two inlets, a different shaped Barren Island, only one island in the middle, and these big intertidal or salt marsh zones. Going back in time some more, this is this is Tidman. It's on its side. This is Jamaica Bay here. This is Voogd, 1719. Excuse me, but I kind of think of this as like the uterus version of Jamaica Bay. There's a whole series of maps from this period of time where it looks like that, where they're kind of emphasizing these two big inlet sides and this kind of open inlet here. This is Robert Ryder's map. This is actually the first map made on land of Long Island. It actually shows all of Long Island. 1674, very early. It's not Jamaica Bay, it's Jamaica Sound here. And this is Rockaway. Rockaway is another Lenape name, Rockaway. And you can see here it has sort of a short end. This is Jansen's map of 1651. Since the first map to show the salt marshes around Jamaica Bay, shows some of the tributary channels. Again, a kind of short a short point at the Rockaways. This is Peter Minuit, the first Governor General of the Dutch colony. And here, there's a whole series of maps from the 1630s, and they don't show Jamaica Bay at all. They just show kind of a wide place here. And we don't know if that was cartographic convention, or they didn't really know, or they didn't care. But it's interesting. And then this is the earliest map we have that shows something that could be Jamaica Bay. This is Adrian Block's map from 1614. He came a few years after Hudson. And the thought is that he saw Jamaica Bay on this side, and he saw Flushing Meadows on this side when he went out this way. This is the guy Block Island's named after. He's the first European to travel through the East River and out Long Island Sound. And it's thought that he just connected the two here like it was all the way through. What's kind of interesting about this is there's some of the recent geological literature suggests that this might have been a proto-course of the Hudson River, and that's why we have Flushing Meadows, where City Field is, and Jamaica Bay, that some old branch of the Hudson River might have carved that out. Anyway, this is what Henry Hudson actually says. When Henry Hudson, he came around, he was traveling from the south. He'd been supposed to try and find his way to China by going north around Europe, the Northeast Passageway. And against his instructions, he sailed all the way across the Atlantic and then landed just north of Virginia and then started working his way very carefully up the North American coast, past Chesapeake Bay, into Delaware Bay, back out around Cape May, up and up and up. And then he eventually found his way around Sandy Hook and into the lower harbor. And he wrote at 3 o'clock in the afternoon on September 3rd, 1609, we came to three great rivers. We stood along to the northernmost, thinking to have gone into it, but we found it had a very shallow bar, a very shouldered bar before it, but we had but 10 foot of water. So what we think happened is he came around, he saw Jamaica Bay and thought that was the mouth of a river. He saw the Verrazano Narrows, he thought that was the mouth of a river, and he saw the Raritan River at the south end of Staten Island. And so he tried the closest one, which was Jamaica Bay, couldn't get in. The next he goes down to the Raritan River, hangs out there, interacts with Lenape a little bit, and then finally he sends a little boat to the narrowest one, which was the winner, right? Curtain 3, he gets through into upper New York Harbor, and he sees what becomes the Hudson River named after him, and he thinks, that's the way to China. I just go through there. I found it. But, of course, he was disappointed when he got up to Albany, and it wasn't China. Okay, so this is how we eventually come, through some combination of quantitative analysis and qualitative analysis, to this idea of what Jamaica Bay looked like. So very shallow in the middle, low intertidal zones to create the salt marshes, some kind of proto version of the Rockaway Peninsula, but we don't know how big it was or how extensive it was. And then this is the land cover maps that so would go with that. And this is a sort of simplified version for some modeling I'm going to show you in a minute. But open water, essentially a very open Jamaica Bay, extensive salt marshes, that's what this blue color is, and then forest back behind. So very shallow, no marsh islands. Our thought is because it was so open and there was so much wave action, that the marshes wouldn't have formed right there in the middle. They would have formed in a more protected location on the edge. These really extensive fringing wetlands, and then forest and streams back behind. Now, if we go forward in time, and we reconstruct what the same landscape looked like in 1877, based on the Coastal Survey charts, we pick 1877 because there's two extraordinarily detailed bathymetric charts from 1877 and 1878 of Jamaica Bay. Then the marsh islands are starting to form in this period, and we think it might be because of agricultural sediments from erosion. Whoops, sorry. Yep. And that leads to this sort of landscape. So you have the Rockaway Peninsula, you have these marsh islands forming, but still these very extensive fringing wetlands, and then agriculture, that's the brown color on this map. And this is what it sort of looked like. This is what people were starting to live here. At this point, this is like the wild, wild east. This was a long, long way away from New York City. It was kind of these kind of ramshackle communities. Eventually, people thought, well, we really need to make this an industrial port. The port of New York in the early 20th century was becoming filled up, and so there was this concept of making Jamaica Bay a port. And this is from a menu from a fundraising dinner. You see these like industrialized islands in the middle, these bulkheaded channels here and ports, a dredge channel that would have gone all the way around Jamaica Bay, and this channel, this canal, that would have gone through the middle of Queens and Brooklyn, up to Flushing Bay and Long Island Sound. This didn't happen, of course, but some of the things to make this happen did start. The bulkheading, the stabilization of the peninsula, the dredging of the channels. And so if we look at it today, this is the DEM today. So you can see there's these shallower parts, but there's also these much deeper parts, especially this channel around here. We have beach stabilization. We have dredging of the channels and the tributaries. There's landfill to create airports and other kinds of coastal development. And then, of course, bulkheading as well. And, of course, this is what's led and allowed the landscape to urbanize to the extent that it has done. So stabilization of the Rockaways after World War II allows it to be settled and to be converted into suburbs, sense of urbanization. And these marsh islands are disappearing, and I'm sure people have come and talked to you about all the huge efforts that have gone into trying to restore these marsh islands and try and make them work by raising the elevations But it's kind of it's a big battle because sea level rise is happening too. And nobody really understands all the mechanisms about why the Marsh Islands are disappearing. Could be because of the nitrogen effluent from the sewage treatment plants, could be sea level rise, could be boat wakes. There's a recent idea that's about changes in the depths leading to sediments being pulled off of the marshes. Not just a recent idea. I just finished a project with Philip Orton and Alan Bloomberg and Kit McManus looking at the value of green infrastructure for ways of trying to mitigate coastal flood protection. I just want to show you this a little bit and then I'll end. The idea was to look at different versions of the landscape based on the historical layers and then see how that would change the physical oceanographics of coastal flooding in this landscape. All the information I'm going to show you next is in this website, adaptmap.info, including a really detailed reconstructions of the landscape and then flooding results on top of it. Philip's a physical oceanographer and from the Stevens Institute of Technology. And we used Philip's model to basically run floods over Jamaica Bay in 1609. So this is kind of once in 10-year storm, and you can see the water coming in and then back out, and in and back out, and basically just filling in those salt marshes and flood and taking them out. If we do the same thing now, you get a really different pattern. You see the water has to kind of fight its way in through this Rockaway inlet here, and then it's kind of held in the bay because it's constrained, it can't get back out, and then you get this flooding on the backside of the Rockaway Peninsula, along Broad Channel, and some of these communities here. And this is just a once in a 10-year storm. If we do the big storm, the once in a 100-year storm, you can see the 1609 landscape is essentially the same with a little bit more flooding up at the top end, which would have been the thing that created the maritime forest. And if, a sea level rise in the past happened, would have driven the forest back and then created the place for salt marshes to form. If we do it today, what happens is, places where people live and work flood instead. So based on our studies of the historical landscape, we developed a series of scenarios to try and decrease flooding using the kinds of tricks that nature gives us. And one of the things that I think became most important is that the bay just being shallower would help a lot to reduce flooding. And so Philip created this scenario where we shallow these channels. It turns out these are over dredged. They're deeper than they need to be for navigation purposes. So if we just were to shallow those and do something to try and narrow the inlet a little bit here, that would be almost as effective as the Army Corps' plan to build a $3.8 billion plan. And you can see all this and all the scenarios on the website. I'm a little running out of time, so I won't emphasize that. But I will emphasize that the cost to benefit ratio are very similar to what the Army Corps has been talking about in terms of protection. Because there's so much there to protect, you can actually do quite a bit in terms of sediment filling. And Philip always wants me to show this graph, which is comparing the flood return period on this axis with the flood height. So this is sort of the probabilistic flood for the Netherlands, which is this blue line, and this red line, which is New York. And the point of this is that our curve is much steeper. So, we have lower storms more frequently. The Netherlands has higher flood heights on a more frequent basis. But we're much more susceptible to the extreme event. When we get an extreme event of 1 in 500-year storm or 1 in 1,000-year storm, it's much bigger for us, which means that top end protection is much more vulnerable. If you get it a little bit wrong in the Netherlands, then you're probably still okay because this curve is so much flatter. But if you're a little bit wrong in New York, then the thing gets overtopped and you're messed up. And that's one of the big advantages of the natural communities, is that they are adapted to this kind of environment. They're much more adaptive on their own to that sort of thing if we give them the space to work. And that being the critical thing. And so there's been a number of very innovative ideas to try and think about how nature does it. This is a living breakwater proposed for the South Shore of Staten Island, which is an engineering solution, but one that's based on thinking about the way nature solves these problems. Whoops. But instead, mostly what we're doing is the old thing, which is, my house is there, I have my deed, the sand is going away, I need the Army Corps to put the sand back. And so they do. They spend millions of dollars bulldozing the sand around, basically using human effort to reconstruct nature's effort. And that's how we get to this idea of the tidal floodgates. And the thought I want to leave you with here at the end is that, as we build these protection measures, that leads to urban development, right? Nobody's going to build in a place that floods on every high tide or a place that's going to get washed away. But once you have a little bit of protection, then you get the first urban development, which then when it does get messed up, when it does get damaged, then leads to the political drive for more protection, which then leads to more development, which then leads to more protection. You see where I'm going with this? Which leads to more development, which leads to more protection. And the only reason this system works is because there's more money coming from outside the system to make it happen, right? And this is just the conversation about this $3.8 billion, tidal surge gate plan, is how much protection should we give? And how much money are we thinking we're going to make through urban development by helping people live in a place that might be not safe for them and their families in the long run? And the question I ask for you is this resilient? Thank you very much.
Thank you, Eric. So, very provocative.
Trying.
Questions? Have some questions from students first.
Yeah. Comments and critiques are also welcome.
Come on, students.
Lay it in.
Good if you have one.
Yeah, please.
So I know that beach hardening usually doesn't work in the long run because of erosion and how water currents work. Does do you know if the Army Corps has a plan to keep with or the budget to maintain their tidal flood and all the beach hardening they want?
Yeah, so that's part of the $3.8 billion is maintenance of those lanes, and also beach stabilization and other places over the long term. And we're working on a paper now where we have a graph of the investments in bulkheading and groin development and beach stabilization or redeposition of the sand. And you can see that it comes after every big storm, right? It's not continuous over time. It's like there's a big storm, there's a political outcry, and then there's a big investment. And then nothing happens until the next thing. Right? Yeah?
So this is a very interesting thing, but you really got to the point in the last 2 minutes.
Yeah, sorry about that. Long build-up,
So every so many years, the inlet is dredged out for navigation purposes.
Right.
Is there any evidence that I have this short question.
Yeah.
Is there any evidence that you know about that has endangered either the environments or the people of Jamaica Bay? Because that sediment is actually being used to make the islands.
Mm-hmm.
Then the other question is, and maybe your colleagues know this, told you, is there enough uncontaminated sand that you could use from anywhere to do the solution that you mentioned?
Right. Yeah. So I think these are really both Philip questions, Philip Horton. But Philip would say, by enlarging the size of the tidal inlet, you're increasing the amount of flooding that's coming into the bay. Because you're changing the tidal, basically the argument is you're changing the tidal prism of the bay. And by changing that tidal prism, the relationship of the amount of water the bay can hold and the size of the inlet, that's what's creating some of the conditions of the flooding. If you assume that the Rockaway Inlet is there as it is. And then the second one is, Philip thinks that going offshore that there are places you could find uncontaminated fill. I mean, remember that this Long Island, as you well know, Jeff, is the result of glacial deposition and sediment deposition, and that extends out onto the coastal plain. So this question of where the sediment comes from, though, is the big question for the communities, because they're really worried that dredge that's polluted from other parts of the harbor will be used in Jamaica Bay, either for filling the channels or for the salt marshes. And they're so concerned that they've gone twice to the legislature to get a law that says they can't do that. And they just re-upped it earlier, either late last year or early this year. I can't remember the timing. So there's a law that says they can't use contaminated fill in Jamaica Bay, period. Right. So that consideration, for me, is off the board. To me, the question then becomes, can you find the clean fill that tries to do it? And Philip thinks you could at expense. What's that?
How much do you need?
I don't know off the top of my head. But if you look on the ADAPT map, there's a report that quantifies it.
I imagine there might be a Corps of Engineers person who loves those tidal gates who might show that same set of arrows about adding sand.
Yeah, no, that's right. That's right. I mean, and I guess this is why I did the long lead up. Is I think we live in a time in the 21st century where where it's really not a question about data and information so much, but whether we have the political will and the wisdom to act on the information we do have. And to do that, I think we need to change a little bit our calculus about how we think about the city and how we make these decisions. This decision isn't only about the people of Jamaica Bay, it shouldn't be made only by them. It's also about the city as a whole, it's about the states involved, and it's about the region, right? And the country, right? This doesn't happen without a separate federal appropriation. So it really needs to be based on that basis, and a long-term basis about how we do these cost-benefit things and what goes into that assessment of cost and benefits. And if it only is the number of buildings that might be destroyed by the next storm, and not the long-term evolution and the opportunity cost of ongoing development, then we don't really think about the true costs of what we're doing. Therefore, we can't calculate the true benefits of what we propose to do.
He is not our oldest student.
Oh, I apologize.
In fairness, I better go back to comment.
Yeah, you should do the pointing.
So I really like the story about the agriculture behind Jamaica Bay that kind of helped fill in and bring in the islands, which...
I should say that's a hypothesis.
Yeah, I like the hypothesis, which would mean then it's a futile exercise for us to keep filling in those islands because what created them is not there anymore. We just let them go.
Yeah, I mean, so I would say, the salt marshes, they were natural in their time, and now natural forces are starting to take them away. But the question of what we do about it is really a value system for us. Are they valuable enough that we want to continue to build up those elevations to keep them there? Should we build them there, or should we do something somewhere else that might be more cost efficient? But the Jamaica Bay environment, just like the land environment, it's reflecting human use and human values, right? So what are our values, and where do we want to put our money in terms of it? So it's like there's a pond in, there was one set of those islands that then they filled up higher, and then they built a pond, and then they filled it with fresh water, West Pond, right? And for the birders in New York City, that's one of the most important birding places in the city, right? A freshwater pond in the middle of a salt marsh system. Historically, there were a whole series of ponds along the edges of Jamaica Bay, Jamaica Pond, Ryder Pond, Garretson Pond, et cetera, et cetera. They're all gone, they're all been filled in, right? So, during Hurricane Sandy, the protective levee around West Pond broke, and the saltwater came in. And the Park Service first inclination was that was nature. We let nature go its course, and now we've lost West Pond. Done. But there was a huge outcry because that habitat type is so rare anymore. And eventually the birders won, and they've recently repaired that, and they're filling it with fresh water again.
Apropos of the salt marsh issue, so yeah. I like the notion of shoaling the bay, because those deep areas are actually depot centers for sediment. If you shoal it, more of that material might make it onto the marshes.
Right.
Stabilize.
Or maybe less would come off, right?
Or less would come off.
Yeah.
That's really interesting.
Yeah. And I would say that that's kind of where this idea is going now, is trying to find some money to do the true sediment modeling. So we could actually test these things out in terms of a full oceanographic, a coupled hydrodynamic and sediment budgetary model. And there might be some people around here that could help us do that.
Well, our sediment budget shows sediment import.
Sediment import, yeah. Yeah.
We have a student here.
So based on your talk, it seems like you, and I know it's common in historical ecology and restoration ecology, you use European colonization and settlement as a benchmark, even though you did mention that there's a long history of Native American occupancy, and there's a lot of evidence to show that they actually also influence, the local ecosystems as well.
Sure.
So I guess two parts. One, do we have any idea of what, the local people of this area, how they have influenced the ecosystems, and also whether or not they have any, strategies or their viewpoint of what resiliency is?
Yes. I can help more on the first one than the second one. So it was part of the larger Wilikia project. We do a lot of work about human beings as potentially ecological actors on the landscape, like other species. And so we model, we know the Lenape lit fires, for example, and that modified the forest. So we actually model the distribution of forests coupled with maps of where the Lenape lived and different population densities. And then we also, they grew farms. They had these 3 sister gardens, so they had plots, and so we modeled that. That was a kind of shifting agricultural system. So we modeled that. For Mannahatta, that was about 1% of the Manhattan landscape. and 99%, you know, the fires went everywhere, but they were mostly ground fires, and so they affected the understory, but not really the overstory very much. And the chestnut and oak hickory forests were kind of adapted to that sort of thing over a long period of time. So yeah, so people often, you know, it is true that there were people there for a long time. It's also true that everything that people does is not bad. In fact, I argue in Mannahatta that the Lenape probably enhanced the biodiversity of Manhattan by creating openings in the forest, and otherwise a primarily forested landscape, which is a novel kind of ecosystem, right? Like these grassland ecosystems. So they probably increased the diversity. But I also say it's a false equivalence to say that, you know, a Lenape person 400 years ago lighting a fire once a year, once every 3 years, is equivalent to building skyscrapers and freeways and malls on top of the landscape, right? That's actually a much harsher kind of intervention, building modern industrial, you know, infrastructure, right? That's a much, much heavier kind of impact on the land. So I think we have to be careful when we talk about human influence that it's a graduated thing. There's little bits, there's a little bit more, and then there's lots and lots and lots and lots. And I think that's the right way to think about it in an environmental sense. And so I'm not a Native person, so I can't speak for all Native people. And I certainly can't speak for all Native people 400 years ago about what resilience is. But I think it's instructive that there were no Lenape people living in the salt marsh. You know, nobody lives in the salt marsh. You know, turtles live in the salt marsh, but not people, because nobody wants to get flooded on two tides. And nobody was living on the Rockaway Peninsula either, even if it was small, because you don't live on the beach, right? You might go to the beach, but then you don't put your wigwam on the beach, right? That'd be crazy. So, you know, I think that they, you know, because they lived every day in the environment, you know, and not indoors in this kind of protected environment, they had a much sort of stronger sense of all the kind of natural patterns that I'm talking about. And I think they would also, I think Lenape scholars would argue that it was also built into not just their daily experience, but their spiritual ways of talking about and thinking about their relationship to the land and the water.
Jim?
A couple of things. Again, going back to the marshes, that's, you know, what I've done a lot. And I grew up in Long Beach. So my main research focus, and as well as professional and life focus, is a little bit east of, it basically picks up where you leave off.
Yeah.
But I get involved in Jamaica Bay too, and I'm very leery of your view of the salt marshes and compressions. I think I mentioned this to you before. And we've been pulling cores and looking at dates in some of the areas where some of the older maps don't show marshes, and we find salt marsh forams down in the pre-colonial era. So let's take a thought experiment. Right now, as we look at the progression of the inlets along the South Shore, the inlets tend to march west with the sand. Now, I did something similar to what you did with Jamaica Inlet at Jones Inlet, and as soon as the western edge is hardened, the eastern edge started moving out in front of it, over a mile. Just since from the 50s to the early 2000s. Similar thing happened in the Fire Island Inlet. When the western edge was hardened, you started getting Democrat building. Looking at the older maps, it looked, in some of the maps that you published, it looks like the inlets had been moving in front of Jones Inlet, in front of Jamaica.
In the Rockaway Inlet, yeah.
Right. Similar to what's been happening in the other bays. And I would say the cartographers were basically just, like a lot of them since, just drawing in the marshes, not really trying to do a good job of it until the mid-1800s, until you get into the 1840s and such. I would say that before we make any real decisions, assuming that the marshes weren't there, that we do some more coring and try and get some funding to do some more research to actually see, you know, to confirm this.
Yeah.
Because the ones we've pulled so far seem to confirm that the marshes were there. And if you look at it with the sea level rise going back thousands of years, where were the fringe marshes 5,000 years ago?
Yeah.
They would have been the ones out in the middle of the bay.
Right, or even farther offshore.
Exactly. Well, even as a kid, we would see pieces of marsh peat wash up on big storms. Marshes that Long Beach and the other barrier beaches that moved up over. So it's a regular thing to pick up pieces of marsh peat, old blackened oyster shells and such thing, jingle shells, creatures that would have been that would have been estuarine, but now these old blackened shells and such are out in front of the beach. So I would say that these marshes are much older, that marshes had been further out as well when the barrier beaches were even further out.
Sure.
And before we assume that they're strictly an anthropogenic artifact, that we better research
I never
that.
said they were an anthropogenic artifact.
From the
I said the Rockaway Peninsula created a protective environment. And what?
I'm talking about the marshes in the middle and the idea that they're the result of farming practices.
Well, I said it's two things. It's the formation of a protective environment by the movement of the Rockaways and potentially the addition of sediment that led it to the right tidal elevation. There was also probably marine sediments there. I mean, I know everybody needs to go.
The moraines are pretty specific. That must have been marsh and must have been out in the middle of the
So we can continue. It's probably time to let people go. There will be pizza down the hall as usual. And
Thank you,
once again,
Larry.
thank you.